reach heaven's joys, O bright and sun. Heart of my heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of
Hello, welcome again to our study of the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings. You know, if you think about this book, it's rather interesting to note that once you get past the creation, that the early chapters 3 through 11, could be divided into three major events. You have the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3. You have the flood, which covers several chapters, 6, 7, and 8. And then you have the confusion of the languages at the Tower of Babel. Once you pass chapter 11, from there forward, really you have three major characters. The first of those characters we've already been talking about. His name is Abraham. The second character will be Isaac in association with Abraham, but then more especially Jacob, his son, and then followed by Joseph at the end of the book. So it's interesting to look at the book in that way. Now, we started with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, and there God urged him, no, he commanded him to leave his father's house and go to a land that he would show him. Now we've seen him go from that place, and he's gone on into the promised land, the land of Canaan. And as he dwells there, he lives in tents. In other words, he really doesn't have a permanent home, but goes from place to place to place. Over a period of time, from the time he's 75 to the time he's 99, he is childless. Well, childless in the sense that he doesn't yet have a child that is the child through whom God will bring about the great promise that he made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. But then we saw the birth of Isaac. And the birth of Isaac led us to the point to where we now have the son of promise in the life of Abraham. As we approach then Genesis chapter 22, it's almost shocking to hear what God asks of Abraham. Let's read together. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Now let's pause just a minute and think about that word tested. He tested Abraham. In the old King James it said he tempted him. That would be inaccurate. Tested is much more appropriate here. And the reason's quite simple. God himself cannot be tempted, neither does he tempt any man. James brings that out in James chapter 1. But God does test, and he tests for various reasons. For example, in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 2, Moses lets us know that God tested Israel to discover what their heart was. And that's something that we all need to realize. They were tested in the wilderness. We may as well be tested in a wilderness of sorts, going through difficult times. God uses those to know where our heart is. And then in the book of Judges, Judges chapter 3 verse 4, the word test is used again. This time God is saying he's going to test his people to see whether or not they will obey God's commandments. And yet, despite the fact that we know God tests, we also need to realize that God has promised never to exceed our ability. The test will not be too great for us. In other words, every man is tempted. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, but he goes on to explain that God will not allow us to be tempted above that we are able, but will with the temptation provide a way of escape that we may be able to bear it. Now, temptation doesn't originate with God, but the good news, God limits temptation, just like he did in the book of Job. He would not let the devil do more than a certain amount to Job on each occasion. He does the same thing for us, and aren't we glad? Ultimately, trusting in God's provision instead of relying on our own is what the life of faith is all about. And that was said by Michael Whitworth in his great little commentary on the book of Genesis, but it's something that we all can readily agree with. We, every one of us, need to learn to trust in God's provision. Now let's see what God tested Abraham with. Verse 2. Then he said, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Take your only son. It is interesting that he says, your son, your only son. It's almost as if God is underscoring the thing that Abraham already knew. Isaac, after all, was his son, but he was his only son in the sense that he was the only one of a kind. He was the only one through whom the promise would be realized. God's already let Abraham know that. So when we're talking about this son, we're talking about the son through whom God would cause Abraham and all of his descendants and ultimately the world to be blessed. And this terminology, this only son terminology, is an interesting concept. When you think about it, in the New Testament, Jesus is called the only Son of God. John chapter 3, verse 16 is quoted by many. And it, of course, identifies him as the only begotten Son of God. But you get the same thing in John chapter 1, verse 18, where he also is described as the only begotten of the Father. Isaac was his only son, just like Jesus was God's only son. That's significant. It will be very important for us to remember that as we continue our study, and particularly as we look at the remainder of the Bible. The Old Testament prophets used the phrase mourning as for an only son on several different occasions, like in Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 26, Amos chapter 8, verse 10, Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. That expression was used basically as a euphemism, a gentle way of depicting, as it were, the deepest possible grief. So here is God coming to Abraham, knowing that the death of this son of promise, would bring about the deepest possible grief in the life of this great man of faith, if it were to take place. Now, Abraham was surrounded by those who worshiped gods who were celebrated or worshiped in the death of children. That's sad, but it's true. People would sacrifice their children to their gods. But the God of Abraham had never before asked for such a sacrifice. Yet Abraham went without asking a single question. Listen as we go on here, verse 3 of Genesis 22. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to the place which God had told him. So here he goes, not one question. You may remember when it came to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah that Abraham asked questions. He asked God, would he limit his mercy? Or would he allow his mercy to extend to an entire city for the sake of, well, ultimately what? Just 10 righteous people. And God agreed that he would spare it for 10 righteous people. But here we have Abraham being given these directions, and he doesn't ask a question. He indeed must have been a powerful, powerful man of faith. Now, God told him to go to Mount Moriah. The land of Moriah is an interesting place. In fact, there are several mounts that are involved there, so we can't really know for sure which one we're talking about here. But it's significant to note that in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1, that we find the Temple of Solomon being built on Mount Moriah. One has to wonder if this is the identical mount that we have already seen talked about right here in Genesis chapter 22. Abraham did everything that he needed to do now in order to carry out this sacrifice. Don't think that he's thinking he's going to get there and talk God out of it. Oh no, because he carries the wood and the fire, and of course he has the sacrifice because Isaac is with him. In verses 4 and 5, we then discover, then on the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place of which God had told him, or far off. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey." Now remember, he had 2 servants with him. They were helping out, but not anymore. Instead, they are to stay with the donkey. And then Abraham says, "The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." Listen to what he said. The lad and I will go yonder to worship. There are those today who would suggest that worship is something that we do every minute of every day, that our lives are devoted to God in worship. That's not really an accurate depiction. And we can see that from the very words of Abraham. He says, "The lad and I will go yonder and worship." There is intent that is involved in this. You must intend to worship in order to do it. It's not something done accidentally or without thought. Now, true enough, I can serve God in all of my life. That word would be very, very appropriate. But I cannot and do not worship God with all of my life. That simply is not the case. So we'll go yonder to worship. But notice one other thing that he said there. It's very important. "And we will come back to you." Abraham believes that he and Isaac both will come back. And we have to wonder, how is it that he could possibly believe that? Well, the writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 11, makes it very, very clear why it is that Abraham could make such a statement. Let's turn over there briefly together and see what he has to say. Beginning in verse 17 of Hebrews chapter 11, that great chapter of faith, we find this record. "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac." Now, because he said tested, we know we're talking about the same time frame, the same event. He offered up Isaac. Now that's interesting. He offered him up. In the original language there in Hebrews chapter 11, the words offered up literally describe an act that's already completed. But let's go back to Genesis 22 and let's see if the act is completed before we go any further in Hebrews. Listen to what happens. "So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son, took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, 'My father.' And he said, 'Here I am, my son.' Then he said, 'Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?'" Now pause and think about that a moment. How would you have reacted if you'd have known what Abraham knew? That his charge was to sacrifice this very son who's asking the question. How did he maintain his composure? Well, again, we're going to see in the book of Hebrews how he was able to do that. But before we go forward in Hebrews, let's read a little bit further here. How did Abraham answer Isaac? I love his answer. "And Abraham said, 'My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering.' So the 2 of them went together." God will provide for himself. Abraham knew that Isaac was, at that moment, in his mind at least, the intended offering. And so when he says God will provide, he's aware of how that provision, at least in his mind, is going to take place. But he doesn't convey that to Isaac. Instead, he trusts in the provision of God. Then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there. That's not the first time we've seen that, is it? He's built an altar in several different places, and he builds another one right here, and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Now, by the way, that's the second time in this one story that God has highlighted your son, your only son. There's no doubting that God understands that this is the child of promise. But how was Abraham able to do that? We've already referred to Hebrews 11. Let's go back there and see the explanation that the writer offers us. Start again at verse 17. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. I've already mentioned to you that the words offered up there come from a word that describes an already completed act. Abraham in his mind had accomplished this act. I would have had to. I don't know about you. But if I was asked to do something this difficult, I would have gone over it and over it and over it in my mind and imagined how it would take place. And given the fact that Isaac is his only son, the great son of promise, don't you imagine that Abraham even had to reason out in his mind, how is God going to work this out? Well, we see the explanation as we read further in Hebrews 11, of whom it was said, In Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Now there comes the answer. Abraham had thought about what God was asking him to do. He knew that Isaac was the son of promise. He knew that through Isaac, all nations of the earth ultimately would be blessed. And so there had to be a way of explaining what God was asking him to do. Abraham's explanation in his own mind was, God will raise him from the dead. God will bring him back. He's the son of promise. And God will make sure that this son of promise lives by raising him from the dead. And in effect, as the writer of Hebrews says, Abraham got him raised from the dead. If he had gone over this in his mind, as we suspect that he had, if he had seen himself actually carrying out the act of killing his own son and offering him as a burnt offering to the Lord, then he must have gone on and thought about how is God going to rectify this. Abraham in his mind had already killed Isaac. He'd already accomplished it in his mind. Oh, he was going to have to carry it out literally in the physical sense, but he had accomplished it in his mind. So when God's angel stayed his hand, when he kept him from lowering that knife and killing his son, in a sense of the word, Abraham received Isaac raised from the dead. At least in his mind, he would have been raised from the dead. But think about it. That's not the only figurative sense in which Abraham received Isaac raised from the dead. Because in point of fact, later there would be another son of Abraham, Jesus, the son of Mary, the one who was adopted by Joseph. Jesus would go to the cross and God would literally offer His only Son on the cross of Calvary. And He would not stay His own hand, so to speak. He would not stop those who would put Him to death, but instead, on the third day He would raise Him from the dead, thereby declaring Him plainly to be the Son of God. And Paul refers to that in his great sermon in Antioch of Pisidia in Acts chapter 13, verse 33. So, though Abraham figuratively in his mind received Isaac raised from the dead, he literally received another son raised from the dead. Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, was raised from the dead after they had crucified Him. Abraham had thoroughly obeyed God. He'd done exactly what God wanted him to do, and he had done so because he believed that God would provide. Now, once his hand had been stayed, notice what took place next. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it for a burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham had said, "The Lord will provide," and indeed the Lord did provide. He provided a ram for the offering in place of Isaac. And then listen, what do you suppose Abraham would call that place? Well, I imagine you've already guessed it. In verse 14 of Genesis 22 it says, "And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide. As it is to this day, in the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided." Jehovah Jireh in the original language. But for us, how beautiful and how significant to call that name, the Lord will provide. You and I need to remember that. Abraham had built an altar there. God had provided a sacrifice, not Abraham's only son Isaac, but instead a ram caught in a thicket. And He always will provide for us, no matter what our circumstances may be, no matter how difficult the trial may seem to be. God will provide so that we can get through that difficult time. Now, the result of all this follows in an exchange between God and Abraham. So listen. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies." Now let's be reminded. The stars of heaven, how many are there up there? Well, we don't know. Even with our great telescopes, we don't know. They're innumerable. The sand of the seashore, same way. We can't count the number of grains of sand on the seashore. Neither can you really count the descendants of Abraham, because he not only has physical descendants through Isaac, Jacob, and those that would follow, but he also has spiritual descendants, children of Abraham who exhibit the same faith that he had. So God's angel goes on. "In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. Now it's happened just exactly the way that Abraham said that it was going to happen. He told his servants, "The lad and I will go yonder to worship, and we will come back to you." We wondered at the time that we read that, how does he intend or expect that we are going to come back? God said, "Kill your son." But now we know that Abraham believed that God could and would raise him from the dead, so that together they would go back and once more be with those servants, and then, of course, ultimately go back to their home at Beersheba. What can we learn from this powerful story of Abraham? Well, the New Testament has several references to this very story. For example, in the book of James, chapter 2, we discover the story of Abraham being brought up. James is talking there about faith. And as he talks about faith, in verses 22 and following, he writes this. Do you see, well, let's look at 21. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works? And by works faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. What we learn first from Abraham, according to James, is that Abraham showed his faith in an obedient response to God. God told him what he wanted him to do. Abraham set out to do that thing. The Apostle Paul also uses Abraham in the book of Romans chapter 4. It's really a long discussion, and we obviously won't have time to look at the whole thing, but it would be good to briefly go back there and observe what Paul has to say about this great man of faith, Abraham. Abraham did what God told him to do, thereby pleasing God. He did not act in order to go to heaven. He acted in order to please God, and that's what Abraham is referenced as in Romans chapter 4. What then shall we say that Abraham our father has found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Now watch this. Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. His belief was counted as righteousness by God. It wasn't righteousness, but it was counted as righteousness. And then in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, we learn about ourselves. We learn that we are saved by the grace of God, but we are saved to be His workmanship, created unto or for good works. We need to be like Abraham. We need to listen to the commands of God and obey them so that we too can be blessed. This is a marvelous story. It reminds us of the faith of Abraham, how it's grown now to where he can do everything that God commands him to do, even when to him it must not have made sense. We need to be like him so that we too can be rewarded at the end of time.
May I reach heaven's joys, O bright and sun, heart of my heart, whatever befall, still be my